All right, we're recording, so whenever
All
you
right.
guys are ready.
All right, Neal, it's great to have you.
Thanks,
here,
Andy.
Here at the home today, and for everybody out there, the people that have been watching Millhouse over the years, we've been not years, 8 months or whatever, but we've basically in the past been focusing on iconic fishermen, Hall of Famers, flats guys, offshore guys, a couple bow hunters, but every once in a while, I want everybody to understand that we're going to have a guest on the show that's got a compelling story. And it's not going to be a fishing story necessarily, maybe a little bit of hunting, maybe a little bit of fishing, but a big story. And Neal Beidleman is basically a legend among giants. If you don't mind, I want to spend just a little bit of time here giving that, our audience your bio, where you've come from and what you've done. Basically, growing up here in Aspen, you had aspirations of skiing at a large level. You were very good at the collegiate level. Your education is very powerful. I mean, you're basically designing right now antennas for satellites, if I'm not mistaken, working for NASA. Yep. Nobody from Aspen does this, right?
Yeah, I guess.
But then, your occupation is, you've got a number of patents, I think 12 in the industry. Some of your photography has been published as the cover of Life magazine. But you're climbing, if you don't mind, people, Neal was on Everest in 1996 when that big tragedy took place, and we lost a number of people up there that night. But besides that, you're climbing Annapurna, Everest 3 times. You went there 4 times. One time you got turned back because of a big avalanche, but you've seen the summit of Everest 3 times. K2, Mount McKinley, El Capitan, the Half Dome. You're skiing. We spoke a little bit about that, but not only racing, but you've skied down. Is that Lahost? Lotte. That's how you say that, down the face of Everest.
Lotte, yeah. It's the part of the climbing route on Everest. We took our skis over and, just kind of messing around.
I mean, nobody skis these places. The Capitol Peak here in Aspen is 14,000 feet. It's the first ski descent. I mean, this is death-defying stuff, people. You skied Pyramid Peak here in Aspen, 14,000 feet. You're running the Wasatch Front Range, a 100-mile trail run in Utah. You're the runner-up twice. You ran a 100-mile race. The Pacific Crest 50-mile winner and runner-up twice. Telluride 30-mile, 5 times winner. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The Elk Mountain Range, the 14 Traverse here in Aspen. What this tells me is that you like pain.
Yeah, I enjoy it. It's fun to get out there and push yourself and come up with these crazy objectives and see what happens. I don't know. I don't look at it as pain, but it is painful at times, of course. Not trying to seek out the pain part, seek out the fun part.
So you have fun during these big painful events.
For sure. Pain is that's the thing that you feel physically. But if you're really trying to do something that is meaningful to you, you don't focus on that. You're trying to figure out how to do this thing that you've conjured up. It takes a lot of creativity. You have to push your mind, your body to do things that you aren't sure that you can really do. Figure out how to do it more efficiently, and the enjoyment and the satisfaction from that is great. I mean, you know that. You've been doing that all your life too.
Well, what I've done is nothing like what I've just read to everybody. I mean, flying down the mountain, is pretty easy. Your gravity is playing a major. I'm not hiking up Everest.
Yeah, well, sure, but when tenths or hundredths of a second matters in a race course and a downhill, you have to change your mindset. If you're just going to go in and be like, well, I'm going to do this as best I can, you're going to be top 20. You have to do something different. You have to push yourself in a way that you're perhaps not comfortable doing, and that distinguishes people who are really good at things from those who become champions. And I'm I'm always in awe at what you've performed. Watching as a kid when you were skiing here and I was racing along with you. You're a little older than me, but I was a Grom out there watching the bamboo get shellacked, and it was always it was a great treat and it was inspiration.
Well, you've always been. It's always been great to see you, around this valley. We've never really spent a whole lot of time together, but I've really admired, and Nicky's a big climber. He goes to Indian Creek. He climbs around here a whole lot. So he's actually been following your career more so than I have, even though from afar I've heard about your stuff, but Nicky's been quite compelled with what you've done.
Well, I think it's appropriate to say you're way more well known in the climbing and mountaineering world than you were as a skier, correct?
Yeah, for sure. It's the whole thing with the 1996 trip and then the media around that, John Krakauer's book Into Thin Air. There's that I'm aware of. There's like 15 books that have been written about that trip in part or parcel. So, it took on a life of its own. It was a very meaningful story, of course, but the media attention just catapulted that thing into one of the most well-known mountaineering stories ever. And so I was part of that. And I guess that's, it's the recognition, I guess, that you're sort of alluding to is not because necessarily of me or my climbing ability or skills, which are, I would say, they're okay, but they're not like outrageous. But that story became something that elevated the people that were there into, a different sort of arena of, I don't know.
Celebrity?
Celebrity's perhaps the wrong word. I mean, it's hate to be
notoriety?
a celebrity. Notoriety. Yeah.
Notoriety. Because you don't want to be a celebrity because of a tragedy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would trade all of that and, for not having to have gone through that and for the people that were lost there, of course. But I mean, it happened, and the story is a very compelling one. And I think people look at it and, those that are really paying attention, there's a lot of great lessons there. And I think it's changed a lot of people's lives in a good way, at least through personal experiences that I've seen and been part of. And so, I don't try to like avoid it per se. If somebody confronts me about it or asks me about it, or, I'm happy to speak about it, but it's not something that I go around and, tout or anything like that.
Yeah, well, what the book he's talking about is John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, which basically documents this Everest attempt in 1996. And I think what was kind of compelling about it, reading the book, I read it a long time ago, and I just read it this week, knowing that we were going to be together.
Yeah.
But it seemed like from the read, you had a number of expeditions up there, and some were very incapable. And one of the quotes in this book was from Rob Hall, which was very interesting because I think you can attest that before you even got up very high, there were a lot of bad things going down. Like you saved or helped save one of the Sherpas' lives, which eventually died, right, from high elevation sickness.
Yeah, he probably had some pre-existing condition, and that was based
at base camp. He was up above, right?
Yeah, he was. He got sick at Camp 2, which it's high. It's 22,000 feet, but it's still 6,000 feet below the summit, and or more than that, actually, 7,000 feet. And he was helped down to the top of the Khumbu icefall, and I ran up in the evening, and we dragged and carried him down through all the ladders and the ropes, sort of the technical part of the climb. And it was intense getting him across, and he was starting to falter at the end. And then we couldn't get a helicopter rescue at that time. So 96, there were a few helicopters that could get there. These big Russian giant whopping helicopters could get in there. Now they have the A-stars that fly in there like, there's 50 or 100 flights a day sometimes.
And the biggest issue back then was the thin air, and they didn't have the power
Yeah.
to climb into that thin air.
Right. And the pilots didn't really have the experience to be able to fly in there. They just weren't trained to do that. So as you go through the story, we'll maybe talk about the rescue and the helicopter rescue of two of the people that were actually on our expedition and where they got rescued from. It was the highest helicopter rescue in the world at the time. It was crazy.
But initially, let me just read this really quickly, because you had a solo Norwegian kid who had ridden his bike to the base and was trying to climb it on his own. The Taiwanese team, which was very inexperienced, and especially the South Africans. But Rob Hall had made mention. He said, with so many incompetent people on the mountain, Rob said with a frown one evening in late April, I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll get through this season without something bad happening up high. Did you feel that?
Perhaps not in the same way that Rob did. So I was an assistant guide to Scott, and this wasn't my company. And I had done some guiding around different places before, but not over there. And Rob had done that. He had his business adventure consultants, and he was basically the first guide to go to Everest and guide it commercially. He wasn't the first guide to take anybody up. David Brashears was there early on with one person, Dick Bass from Snowbird fame, as you probably know. But that was a unique situation. It's kind of a one-on-one situation. Rob was the first one to turn it into commercial guiding sort of in the way that we understand now. It's obviously evolved since then as well. But so for him to say that, he's speaking from, a guide's perspective, having seen these things develop and unfold many times from that position. So I think we were all aware at some of the inadequacies and inexperience of people and expeditions there, but I don't know. Perhaps it was naive, but the mountain, especially a mountain like Everest, tends to weed out these people early, and even before.
In what way?
Well,
elevation sickness and stuff
mentally?
like that?
All kinds of ways. Just the physical challenge, the complexity, the inexperience. So the worst person that you can have on the mountain or on your expedition is somebody who's not really, really experienced, but also not horrible. They're the person that has enough strength and experience to just get themselves into trouble, and you then become friends with them. You care about their experience. You encourage them perhaps more than you should at times. You want them to succeed. That's your job as a guide and as a person. You want people to get the most out of what they're doing. But they're the ones that can get to a place where, when things go bad, they don't have the ability to really get themselves out. Somebody who's completely inexperienced never even gets to the point, they get spit out the back before that even happens. So that's not always the case, right? Every situation is unique and different. But I think when Scott and I looked at all the people around, we kind of chuckled and laughed, thinking that half of these expeditions they had no chance, and they were non-factors. And
so they're going to be left behind right away.
Yeah, right away.
Like at Camp 2 or whatever.
Wherever the mountain's going to turn them away, they're going to get out of there. They'll have had a good adventure, but they're not going to get to the point where they're going to get high enough on the mountain to really get into the kind of trouble that actually ended up happening.
So I want to take it back.
Yeah.
You're climbing the highest mountain in the world.
Yeah.
How do you train for that? What are you doing physically around the valley to be able to train physically and mentally for a challenge like that?
Right. So good question. So back in 96, and when I first started climbing in the Himalayas in 92, that was a long time ago. And, I was a lot younger then, and staying fit was different. It was easier. Just the stuff I was doing with running and just my normal lifestyle allowed me to be fit. I didn't even really train specifically for Everest, but we were.
It was just your lifestyle.
Yeah, some of the people that I was around with, we were as fit as anybody around, doing these 100-mile races and climbing like crazy. And So it wasn't a big deal. As I got older, I had to think about actually training. I've been working a lot and, in the office, and I sit in front of the computer 60 hours a week. So to go, for instance, on our last trip to Everest, which was just 2 years ago, I was 58, 59 years old. So I started skinning more regularly up the mountain, hiking up with our skis in the morning and doing double laps on Ajax and just skinning up from the base of Highlands to the top of Highlands Bowl, before work, 5 days a week. I got in just hundreds of thousands of vertical feet, and that really helped. And I was very dedicated about it. And then we pre-acclimated by using these tents where they basically, you take an oxygen machine, and instead of pumping oxygen into the tent, like an older person might use to help them breathe, you take the exhaust, which is nitrogen, you pump that into the tent, and that displaces the oxygen that's there, and it simulates high altitude. So it's kind of a horrible experience sleeping in these things, but you can pre-acclimate. And our trip this last time on the north side of Everest, we climbed Choyu, which is the 6th highest peak in the world, and Everest, round trip from the United States in 23 days. So we climbed Everest from the advanced base camp to the summit in 22 hours. So
is that the fastest time ever?
No, there are definitely people who have tried to break the record and have gone, considerably faster than that. But if you look at people who have just been there, not trying to actually set speed records, you'll find very few, if anybody, that climbed even close to that fast. We cut off days off of the normal, many days off of the normal time there.
Were you short on time? Is that why it took so?
Yeah. So I was climbing with a good friend of mine, and I won't say I was guiding, but perhaps a little, climbing adult experience, supervision kind of thing.
And this was 2 years ago?
Yeah. And with a super good friend of mine, and he's really fit. He's an executive and doesn't have a lot of time, but he's very dedicated to his training and to this. And then with another friend from Tahoe who's a professional skier. And we had a very small window to be able to go try this. And we wanted to just have the trip of a lifetime. So instead of just going to Everest and trying to acclimate on the mountain, we thought acclimatization is acclimatization. Why don't we go and climb a whole separate 8,000 meter peak for acclimatization, then run over to Everest, and a couple of days later try to summit that. And that's basically what we did. On the north side, you can now drive essentially to the base camps of Everest and Choyu, because you're on this very high plain, the Tibetan Plateau. You can just drive right up to where the mountains kick up, and off you go. On the south side in Nepal, you have to trek in to be able to get to the base camps or take a helicopter.
And how far is that?
It depends which mountain you're going to and how you're doing it now. There's the proliferation of helicopter transport in the Himalayas is crazy now. It's off the chart. So most people who are not pre-acclimated will fly to Lukla, which is about 9,000 feet, and start their walk there. So it's not so much about the distance away from the mountain, it's the altitude which they land at.
Right. Where did this dream come from? Growing up in Aspen. You have these big 14,000 foot mountains locally.
Yeah.
When did you start thinking outside of the box, I want to go there?
I don't know if there was a single point, Andy, but it's a good question. Growing up here, as you did, the mountains are always calling, and you do them, you get good at them, and it makes you think well, what else could you do? And what would be the next step? And okay, I was able to run up the Bells or Pyramid. That was pretty easy. There's other mountains out there that are outrageous. What about those? And then I started going to school at CU, and CU has a very good, University of Colorado has a very long and storied history with climbing, because of El Dorado Canyon and what's in Boulder. A lot of great climbers ended up in Boulder. So I got exposed to people who were going to the Himalayas and other places, and I just got intrigued by it. And I started getting very fit with mountain running, and I didn't want to just run races to some finish line. I wanted to incorporate that fitness and the ability to just go really long distances and outrageous places and climbing and marry them together. And our first trips over to the Himalayas and to some other places involved some of the early sort of forays into what's maybe more common now, sort of speed climbing, where you try to do these big adventures as fast as you can.
And that was Steck's thing, wasn't he?
Yeah, Uli was amazing. I mean, that guy was a world-class athlete on top of it, and a really, super fit guy. And he had a vision to do these crazy things. So in climbing, there's an old adage that speed is safety. The less amount of time you can spend in these dangerous places in harm's way, to all the objective dangers out there, then perhaps the safer you are. And, storms come in, all kinds of things happen. So if you can go and condense a climb, by, take 3 days and make it 1, or 5 days and make it 2, or just go for it and do something crazy in, a single 40-hour push. If you have that fitness, you can target the weather. For a fact that over that short period of time, the weather's going to be good. You get up and down fast, and you rely on your fitness and not so much on all these other things that will change over time as you're on the mountain for longer periods.
And that's why it's probably really good to climb with only a couple, 2 or 3 guys versus a big team.
Yeah, big is slow. There's reasons for it, of course, and in the commercial guiding world, there's economics involved. There's all kinds of other things at play. So trips are a kind of a blend between what you would really like to do on your own versus what is required and necessitated by the economics to be a business and to be safe and all that. But when I go on my own, I like to try to go as fast as I can, and not so much to break records, but it's just fun. It's just more fun to cover that ground quickly and safely, and just, I don't know, there's a real reward in that for me.
Have you read, or do you know of David Goggins? He wrote the book Can't Hurt Me.
I don't know.
He's the only individual that has gone through all the extreme training of the military, the Navy, the Army, and the Marines. And he runs all these ultra races, 100-mile races. Badwater?
Yeah, Badwater. He's
250-mile races. I find this is really intriguing to me, to find somebody who really gravitates to something that's almost impossible to do.
Yeah, right. It's, that's human nature. Whether it's in business or personal life or through climbing challenges, skiing, it's always our minds are always thinking about what's next, what could be possible if you allowed it and if you thought about it and if you had the adventure sort of gene, I guess you might want to go try it.
But what's interesting to me is what you're doing. You're dancing with the devil, because so many of these people have died.
Yeah.
And at high elevation, you have all the illnesses.
Yeah.
Well, you probably don't view it that way.
No.
But you have to understand it.
Yeah, it's there for sure. I mean, it's like in any sport that's, if you're going fast or if you're exposing yourself to some objective danger, if you make a mistake, there are bad consequences. Again, I refer back to downhill racing, right? When you're skiing really well, you're not thinking about crashing into the net or the trees, but
it's there.
It's there, right? Even if it's not you, if your binding comes off or, something unexpected happens, really bad consequences are very close. So
what's interesting is when I got hurt in 1981 in Wengen, Switzerland, at the finish line there, it's a long race. It's 2.5 minutes long, so you're fatigued by the time you get to the bottom. And the year before, I got hurt there. The lip was extra big. I flew all the way to the flat, caught an edge, and went into the fencing head first. and in my career. The very next year, I was standing at the finish with Bob Beatty, doing commentary, stand-up for the event for ESPN. We're standing right there. And that was the first year they removed the hay bales for protection and put in netting. But the netting, they didn't have any smooth surface. And a young Austrian kid, while we were standing there doing a stand-up, they had training going on, he went off that lip and went too wide. His ski tip went through the netting. And now you got one leg stopping, going 60 miles an hour. And it tore his pelvic and tore him basically in half and he slid all the way down, leaving a 4-foot wide streak of blood, and died right before our eyes.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And like you're saying, I mean, this is a sport that we've been doing forever. And in the old days, people used to hit trees and die periodically. But right before my eyes, a year later after I got hurt, I watched this guy perish right there. So it's very similar to you climbing Everest, because there are still bodies up there, right, that have been there for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, Scott Fischer's still there. And when I went back the second time to Everest, I made a point, not on the ascent, but on the descent, to stop and, try to find where he was. He'd been moved off of the main track, but stop and paid my respect. It was very powerful to kind of be there and to perhaps in some way close that, that chapter and, say goodbye to Scott personally there. But these are very high places, and certainly with modern helicopter technology, it's with money, some of these bodies can be brought down. But back in '96, that was just unthinkable. It's too much effort. It's too hard. I mean, you can barely get yourself up there or pick a lightweight pack up, let alone carry or drag a body down.
So when you were up there in '96, are you talking about like you would step over bones and carcasses and?
Well, not bones and carcasses. I mean, people are in their climbing suits and down suits and things like that. But there are, you could see sort of a mound of, with some
color,
nylon exposed or a boot or something. I mean,
wow.
This is a little bit, morbid perhaps, but when we were first climbing up, as we were getting acclimated to the base of the Lhotse face, this is a really enormous face. It's 4,000 feet, and it's a big collection zone. So eventually everything that's loose, rocks, stuff, bodies, tents, gear, ends up at the bottom. And then it gets churned through the glacier, and sometimes it, cycles up and gets melted out. And we're just climbing up there, and I look and I see some color, and we keep going, and it's like half of a torso and an old leather climbing boot and super old gear just sticking out of the glacier. And I was like, holy crap, right there in front of you. This was probably, I'm just guessing, perhaps 20-year-old gear at that time from '96, so back in the '60s or '70s. And you kind of sit down and, I took a photo, tried to be respectful, but just to remember what I saw there, and you move on. So it definitely happens.
Because the first time it was climbed, it was like 1911, if I'm not mistaken.
Perhaps some of the early exploratory expeditions happened that early from the Chinese side. I think the earliest one that I'm familiar with is in the 20s. And then Mallory and Irvine, came very close to making it to the summit. There's still big debate as to whether or not they actually summited. They found Mallory's body. Irving supposedly had the camera. If they found his body, or eventually might find his body, perhaps that film could be developed. So there's been tons of speculation and books written about that.
Right.
So for people who are not familiar with the whole process of, summiting Everest, start from base camp to the summit. How many camps? What do you eat? Freeze-dried food? What are you carrying?
Yeah.
All that stuff.
So certainly, to answer your question, the answers have changed over time. So what we did on our most recent trip a couple of years ago is very different than what we did in '96. But on '96, You trek in. The trek is perhaps 10 days long, 7 days long, something like that. You land then in a plane or a very old helicopter at Lukla, which is about 9,000 feet. And then you trek through these villages as you go higher and higher. The villages get smaller and more alpine-like and rustic until the very top ones are, back at that time, were just like, shepherd's stone huts, basically. And then you arrive at base camp, lower base camp, which is about 17,500 feet. And that's where you'll set up your main staging area. So we had a cook tent and a couple of Sherpa kids that cooked for us. And then we had, I think on that trip, 6 climbing Sherpa that worked with us. And we had 8 clients and then 3 guides, Scott Fischer, myself, Anatoly Bukrev. And so from there, the process is, in a nutshell, is to climb up the mountain, to put in the ropes, establish the camps, move the gear up higher and higher, but you have to do that balancing your acclimatization. So you'll go up and you'll feel just horrible climbing to 20,000 feet. It's miserable.
What's it feel like?
Oh, it's just like you just want to get out of your body. It's really hard. You're moving at a snail's pace. You have a splitting headache. You just, your vision gets all kind of wacky. You're just wondering why you're there. Then you come back down and you relax at base camp for a day or two, depending on what the cycle is, or rotation is. You start to feel better. And the next time you go up, it's not so hard getting to that same place, and you push yourself further. But the next little thing above that is it's miserable. And you keep doing this, but eventually, after a whole bunch of trips up and down the mountain, you can climb to 24,000 feet really pretty rapidly and without, feeling the ill effects of that. And then in that trip, we used oxygen. So we started using small amounts of oxygen at Camp 3, which is at 24,000 feet. Each camp is roughly about 2,000 vertical feet above the next. Scott and I didn't just to save on money. It was getting oxygen there and paying for it. Transporting up the mountain was really expensive, and we didn't have a lot. So we climbed to the South Col, which is 26,000 feet, just with a very small amount of oxygen right at the end. And then you sleep there, and then you use oxygen, and the oxygen lowers the effective altitude some amount. I don't exactly know the amount. It depends what flow rate you're at and your own physiology, but it makes it easier. And the next day you go to the summit and you come back to the South Col. So you're probably 4 or 5 weeks, perhaps even 6 weeks into the expedition now. And then you return through the camps as you come back down. And obviously the tragedy changed a lot of those circumstances.
Yeah, walk me through that whole demise, if you will.
Yeah.
What happened up there in the storm?
Yeah.
Just take me through the whole process from Camp 4 up to the summit and back down.
Well, as we talked about, there's so many books written about it. It's a huge story, so I could go on for hours and hours, which I won't. But if I were to summarize it as succinctly as I could here, basically we had 2 groups that ended up, there were more than that, but there were 2 main commercial groups that ended up at the South Col at the same time. It was Rob's team and then Scott's team. And then there were a couple of Taiwanese people there and some other folks that peeled off and didn't go, South Africans, as you mentioned earlier. But Rob and Scott were friends. I had met both of them on K2, and they're great guys, and they both started making their livings professionally as guiding or through guiding in their companies. So as close of friends as they were, ultimately, in reality, they're also competitors for a small amount of people who could come and pay the money and have the time and the experience to go and try to climb Everest. And this is 96, so this is like at the dawn of the internet, right? So there weren't internet ads out where people could Google, hey, I want to climb Everest, and boom, up pops these company names. These were tiny little 1-inch square ads in the back of Climbing magazine in the classifieds, and that was their outreach, and then word of mouth. So I think what I'm getting at is I'm setting the stage is that neither Rob nor Scott wanted to be the guy that failed if the other guy was successful. I think they were both willing to turn around if that was what was the right decision, but not independently of the other. They wanted to share the same outcome. That's the only way that they felt that their business could sort of maintain their position for the next year's marketing to get more people to come.
And let me interrupt here.
Yeah.
How much pressure did having a writer, John Krakauer, writing for Outside Magazine, put pressure on that situation?
I think a lot. Less probably for Scott, maybe more for Rob. John Krakauer was part of Rob's team.
Right.
But he was writing about the whole experience. And, the book that he ended up writing was obviously not the book he thought he was going to go write there. He was there. I think Rob probably, maybe Scott as well, didn't necessarily appreciate John's cynicism towards commercial guiding at the time. John was a very good climber himself in his own right, and I think he was sent there by Outside Magazine to sort of uncover kind of the truths of guided climbing, and with the bent that it probably wasn't the greatest thing for climbing out there. But I think as John went along, he started to realize and appreciate that it was really hard to do this. And, I think he saw the negative aspects, but part of it, I think it changed his mind a little bit in some ways. But then at the end, when the tragedy happened, of course, all of his fears came true. And, the book is very compassionate telling of, the people that he got to know and how they lost their lives. But it's a harsh judgment on, what happens in these really hard environments when money plays, some part and people's livelihoods are at stake. So to finish the thought really quickly about Rob and Scott being competitors, what that presented was a situation where neither one of them wanted to be the guide that turned around first, right? Nobody wanted to give up that advantage. But it wasn't just competition per se. They also had a lot of respect for each other. So if my buddy thinks it's okay to continue, why am I the guy that's turning around? Am I making a mistake? Am I being, silly about this? So you get this situation where there's decision by no decision, And
a lot of pride is at stake too.
A lot of pride, right? So the whole emphasis is about going up. And then other things like these, they're just like so many layers of the onion that started wrapping themselves around that created this rogue event. So Scott became ill during the climb and was faltering. He was way off the back. So he wasn't even in a place to make the decisions at the head of the team. He was back behind. So I ended up like fixing ropes and just carrying forward until somebody told me, don't do that anymore. I mean, obviously, at some point when things get really bad, when they did get bad, it was clear that, look, it's like, we got to deal with this. But it wasn't my role, and I didn't feel like I had the responsibility or the authority, I guess is the right word, to turn somebody away from the summit 100 yards just because, we were an hour past our turnaround time. I mean, that was Scott's call, and he wasn't there to do that. So I just kept going. And in retrospect, I wish I had turned people around, but I don't know, guides prior to this had gotten in a lot of trouble, had gotten sued because, everything's fine, right? Nobody knows the bad outcome. It doesn't happen. Clients get back down to thick air and they start to feel great. And they're like, why did you turn me around? And they can't imagine that how out of it they were, how dangerous of a situation it was in there. There's no acknowledgement or recognition of that. So it's a very dangerous thing to get involved in that sort of, peer pressure kind of environment.
So they get to the summit.
Yeah.
And they take way too much time, and you can see the storm brewing.
Kind of. I have pictures from the top, and if you look away from the storm, it's searing blue sky. And the storm came from the Bay of Bengal. It was a pre-tropical monsoon sort of storm. It was very violent. So it wells up below you in the jungle, and as it rises, it mixes with the cold air. It creates a really bad storm. So when you look down, you're looking at the top of clouds, and you can see clouds, and you can tell that, there's something brewing, we should get down, but you don't look up like, say, watching a tornado or a thunderstorm come in. You don't have that sort of perspective on like, oh my God, this is going to hit here in 3 minutes and it's all over.
What's it like? What was it like that day when you got to the summit, though? And you're a little bit back. What's the view from the top of Mount Everest? Only a handful of people have ever been there.
Yeah, well, that and all the people that fly in airplanes. So, it's like it's like being in an airplane, except you're sitting on the ground and you just can sit there and take it all in. It's just crazy high up there, and there's nothing higher than you. And when we first got there, it was pretty clear in all directions, or at least all the big peaks are coming out of some of the, the jungle fog and clouds below. And it's breathtaking, it's just, breathtaking doesn't even begin to capture it. It's just like, I don't know. It's the connection of you and where you are and what you see out there is just it's something I wish everybody could experience somewhere, whether it's on Everest or fly fishing off a boat or sitting on a picnic table outside their house. It's for a human being to have the chance, the opportunity to see something like that and to feel your connection to the earth like that is really remarkable, and it's a very powerful experience.
You're in the sky, but you're on land.
Yeah.
And I say this because we had another podcast guest who's a very well-known captain in the Florida Keys, and he loves to fish in the dark. He goes out earlier than anyone else, and he tarpon fishes in the dark, and he's seen some interesting things in the sky. Yeah. And so I'm just asking,
UFOs.
Yeah. And so have you seen any interesting things out there?
Beyond hallucinations?
You've been in the sky many times.
I've seen a lot of weird stuff. I don't know what's real and what's not. So I don't know.
Come on.
Nothing like that. I've seen some pretty remarkable things, but they've all, at least in my mind, have had explanations. But
all right.
You never know.
But also, too, getting to the summit of Everest, you had to earn that. You just can't all of a sudden buy a ticket and be there.
I think in the modern world of climbing, you can sort of. That's an overstatement. Like, I think sort of the view of the real hardcore naysayers is that, anybody with zero climbing experience can just today decide they're going to go climb Everest and go do it. And I don't know, there might be a couple unique situations where some people have done that, but most of the people who even would fall into the inexperienced class, or be classified that way or viewed that way, have climbing experience to some level. And some of them are very good athletes, and, they're adventurous as well. And I don't know, I get kind of bummed out sometimes when I hear climbers speaking very, in some ways almost elitist, like they don't have the right to be there. And in many ways, the book Into Thin Air and the stories and photos I published and talks I give, to kids at school and all over the place, those stories are meant to be inspiring. So then people get inspired and they go do these things, and then they get badmouthed because they're following their dreams, right? So that's kind of hypocritical, sort of harsh. So I think that people should be as prepared as they can, and they should try to earn it, as the question started here. But there's different levels of that, and everybody has a different perspective on what that means. in 96 and how I kind of grew up climbing is very different than it is now today. And it's up to the guides to assess their client's ability and perhaps even help them along in their process or their career in climbing. So a lot of times now, guides will go to, clients or people will go to guiding companies and they'll start on easier peaks and they'll gain experience, and then eventually they'll go through this process where the final objective is an Everest or something like that. And
right.
There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's fine.
Probably the smartest way to go about doing that.
Right. I mean, you see it in fishing, right? There's guides that are very well respected, and they take people out and teach them the love of the sport and the art of the sport and how to get better. And these people couldn't necessarily go catch a big fish all by themselves. They're brought there. But what kind of experience are you giving them? I mean, it's life altering in many cases. It changes their perspective on things. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But with how crowded and how commercialized Everest has gotten, has it lost its charm in your eyes?
In some ways. So you can go there and you can look this direction. I'm speaking sort of rhetorically, but you can see the things that you don't like and you just go, this sucks. This is really bad. And part of it is really bad. But you can turn your eye and look 30 degrees to the side or, off to the side of the trail, and, nothing's changed there in, 1,000 years. And it's gorgeous and it's beautiful. So a lot of people have benefited from the advent of climbing in the Khumbu region and Nepal. Nepal, the tourism industry is kept that country afloat in many ways. And the people in the mountains have, they've prospered. Their families, they have kids that are going to school and traveling, and they have schools and healthcare available to them. And these people were, impoverished, beforehand. So there are some benefits as well. Not to say that just unmitigated access to the mountain and people overrunning the mountain is a good thing. So Nepal has to get their act together. The people in charge of all this have to figure out the balance between just collecting as much money as they can and trying to preserve the resource and the culture. The guides have to be reasonable about it. But it's complicated.
So your latest ever summit was 2018. Do you have any desire to go back?
Well, yeah, obviously, always. That never goes away. Practically, I don't know. I mean, the world's changed in the last couple of years. In many ways, the whole COVID thing. Hopefully this all goes away. But the mountain's been, there haven't been any climbers. There hasn't been any tourism at all. So, perhaps in a year that changes. We'll see what really happens. They've already canceled all the expeditions for the fall this year, and we'll see about what happens in the spring of next year as well.
When did you realize stuff was about ready to hit the fan?
Yeah, so on the way up, there were many little things that weren't quite right, but in life, and as is in climbing, not everything is always perfect there. As we were going along, the first thing that really struck me and I had to do something about was at 10 o'clock in the morning. Or it was actually earlier than that. It was probably about 6 or 6:30 in the morning. I realized that the ropes hadn't been fixed up to the south summit and then past that through the Hillary Step. And that was the job of our head climbing Sherpa, along with his counterpart on Rob's team. And I got to this place called the Balcony. It's about 27,000 feet. And it's the first time you come into the sun. And there's Lobsang. And Lobsang was supposed to be ahead. He was supposed to have departed 2 hours earlier and placed the ropes so that we didn't have to wait. The last thing that you want to do on an expedition is have everybody sitting, not moving, getting cold, burning oxygen, burning daylight. So you come up with this routine, this plan. Everybody has like their little job, and it's got to be synchronized. And their job was to get the ropes put in place beforehand. Nobody had climbed the mountain prior without ropes. The fellow you mentioned who rode his bike there tried, but he was climbing solo, and he made it to the south summit only. So I see Lobsang, and I'm like, what's up? We can't go anywhere with these people until the ropes are fixed. And Lobsang's been dragging this other person up the mountain. You can read the book about it.
Pittman.
I won't be calling out
Sandy
names here,
Pittman.
but it's read the book. But anyway,
So he was tired. He was exhausted.
He was tired, and he hadn't been acclimated as well. You mentioned the Sherpa that died earlier in the expedition. That was his uncle. So Lobsang had zipped down to Kathmandu to see him, and then he came back. And he was a very talented climber and all that, but he was also climbing without oxygen. And it's just...
That's irresponsible as a guide, right? To climb without oxygen. He needs full power.
It's too much. So we had asked, Scott's position on this was that all of the Western guides certainly were going to use oxygen. And he left it a little bit more up to the Sherpa to do their thing. I mean, they're a different breed. It's a whole... it's different for them. Just genetically, they've grown up in, for generations in this area. So they do much better at altitude than us from, effectively the lowlands. And their roles were a little bit different than the Western guides that were there. I mean, certainly they could have been exchanged, and they are now in modern times, but their role was a little bit different. So I think Scott was less concerned about Lobsang climbing without oxygen, but the other Sherpa were climbing with oxygen. But anyway, he just was incapable of doing at that point what he needed to do. So I grabbed the ropes from him, and I took off, and I started fixing the ropes, by myself. It's a lot of work. And I had people below that were holding the rope and then anchoring it as you go up. But I fixed, hundreds of feet of rope, and it takes time. So now everything's starting to slow down a little bit. So,
were you freaking out at all?
Not at the time. So it's still early in the day, right? So the if things really get bad at that point, the fallback is you just pull the plug on the whole thing and you turn around, right? So again, it was the weather was okay, and at least the people around me seemed to be doing okay. We're moving slower than we had hoped, but going along. So my thought at the time, I guess, was something to the akin of like, not everybody's going to make it to the top today, but a few people will. And that's sort of natural. That's sort of the normal attrition on a summit day like that anyway. As it turned out, every single one of our clients, made it to the top, late in the day, but they did. So I wasn't freaked out, but you start to sense that things are different, and you're starting to figure out, how do you react to this, and how do you respond? And Scott's not around, so there's no way to have like this little powwow of what's going on. So you keep doing your job and you adapt what's going on. So I took Lobsang's role, and I fixed ropes and figured that he would, in turn be with clients, which was my original role. When I got to the South Summit, which is just this long traverse away from going through the Hillary Step into the top, the summit, you can see it's right there. It's 300 feet above you. It's a ways away, and it's the most technical part of the climb, but it's just right there. Kind of like being at the start of Highlands Bowl and looking up at the flag. It's similar to that. A reference to local skiing here.
Sure.
Right? So I waited, and I kept thinking that Lobsang would be right behind me. And, he's not fixing ropes, and he's not carrying all that weight now. And we would change our roles back, and he would go and fix the rope across the summit ridge through the Hillary Step, and I'd go back and assist with clients. But he never showed up. So time's clicking away, and I spent, a long time just sitting there at the South Summit, like a long time. It was a couple hours waiting for something. I don't know. And finally, Anatoly was there. And we had one more rope. I had one more rope with me, and I'm like, we got to go. So we Rochambeaued for who got to go first. We tied into the rope and we climbed out on the ridge and we fixed the rope on the Hillary step. The photo you have is that same rope being held out by the wind just prior, just like, I don't know, 50 feet shy of the Hillary step.
So that's Anatoly.
That's Anatoly. Yeah. So Anatoly is also not climbing with oxygen as well. And he was told to. He knew that he was supposed to. He brought a bottle of oxygen and a regulator all the way up to the balcony, that 27,000 foot point that we first got to the sun in. And he looked at me and said, "I no need," and he gave it to me. So I'm like, well, I'm happy for another bottle of oxygen, but I'm already carrying all this other shit. I don't need that extra weight.
7 pounds or so, or how much was that?
Yeah, plus the regulator, it's a lot. So I left the regulator, but I took the bottle of oxygen because that's gold. You don't carry it that high and then not keep going with it.
Is that like an ego thing for him?
Yeah, so egos.
I mean, does that go under the resume? Is it a big highlight that you climbed Everest without oxygen?
For sure. And ego is part of it. Maybe that's a bit harsh of a word. It's not just about ego. It's about your upbringing, where you come from, how you view climbing with oxygen, the whole philosophical fairness of climbing issue.
So that's more of a European stance, though, right?
Less European, more, he was from Kazakhstan, so he's from the old Russia, CCCP. And he was brought on as a very young kid and became part of this thing called the, I forget the name of it, but he became what they called a sportsman, right? So you probably were familiar with that. So
the ethical way of climbing should be organic without help.
It, in some people's views, sure, it'd be great to run with a pair of sneakers and a pair of shorts and no shirt and no water and be able to do that for 100 miles. But, some people can, some people can't. So every climb and everything that you put together is its own event, right? And you choose the standards at which you want to climb at and how you want to do that. So, there are more, what would be the right word? They're cleaner approaches to climbing. There are ascents that are truly, like these seminal events in the world of climbing, where like Messner and Hobler climb Everest without oxygen. The first time that it was climbed without oxygen, and
like Honnold and El Cap.
Exactly. These are things that become benchmarks, and they change the way that we view those challenges. But not everybody can solo El Cap, and not everybody can climb Everest without oxygen. So does that mean that nobody should climb Everest who doesn't have that natural ability? I don't know. Anyway, this is a commercial trip, so we have people on our trip that aren't professional. I mean, there's no question about climbing with or without oxygen for these people. And for Anatoly to climb without oxygen after, we had talked about it and agreed that this was the approach, is, he was being very prideful and staying true to his upbringing. But I think he failed to appreciate that at that moment, he wasn't there climbing for Anatoly Bukrev. He was climbing there, along with the Western, commercial expedition. He had other responsibilities. And he was able to climb at the pace that I was climbing at, fixing ropes. And, he and I got to the top first and all that. But once he got there, he couldn't stay around for very long.
He had to get down.
He had to get down.
Yeah.
And I've been on Everest twice now with in different situations where the oxygen system has failed. And, the second time I was up there, my mask and the inlet to the mask got all inverted for the last several hours of the climb. I didn't know it. I was breathing into the mask, but not getting the benefits of the oxygen. It was freaking hard work, right? It was horrible. And I made it, but I was in no position to make decisions for somebody else and help somebody else out in that position. It was like all I could do to keep my act together. And once I realized at the top that it was messed up, another friend of mine, noticed it after I asked him to just kind of give me the once over, because I was just feeling like way out of it. And he took this big pucker of the mask, this plastic mask, like a painter's mask, and popped it back between the straps so it closed off the seal where the oxygen was coming in. And within 30 seconds, I went from being like on the moon to like going, oh, okay, I'm better. So, I mean, it clearly changes, one, your physical capability and your mental acuity and your awareness of what's going on. And the last thing that it really affects, there's probably more, but the other important one is that if you're climbing without oxygen, you can get cold very fast. Your blood gets really thick. And here he is sitting at the top of Everest waiting around for people to show up. We don't even know where they are, right? We're just kind of in suspended animation up there. We can see that other people are coming. There's, it seems a responsible thing to do to wait, not just leave. But he's getting cold and he's out of it. So he's got to get going. And that's what he did. He took off. So, there's a story of why he did and what he did on the way down. And some of it I believe, some of it I think is probably, perhaps put together afterwards to justify what he did. Not trying to cast judgment on that. It's been a long time. I'm not trying to, throw stones. Anatoly is a really good friend of mine. We summited Makalu together, climbing without oxygen, actually. I was 7th American. He was first Kazakh guy. We were the only 2 people on the mountain. It was the most perfect ascent I've ever made of a peak. It was just like, it was the ultimate thing that we could have done, and we achieved it there. He was an assistant guide to me when I was guiding on Choyu. We were friends in Boulder. We drank beer together. We ran together. And I loved Anatoly. But at that time, for whatever reason was in his head and how this all went down, I think he made the wrong choice. And, in some ways he made up for it afterwards. But
do you think people died because of that bad decision?
I don't know.
That's a pretty harsh question. Sure.
I mean, you could make the case that, a lot of the things that we did, Anatoly's decisions, my decisions, Scott's decisions, Rob's decisions, we're all culpable in some way to what happened. But we continued up. Scott wasn't there to turn people around. Rob, who was sort of he was the master, the sensei of how to do this. He violated his own rules. He actually, we found out later through the radio reports that he went from the summit, went down and helped another one of his clients who was very slow back to the summit.
Back to the summit, yeah.
Right? I mean,
that was Doug Hansen?
Doug Hansen. Yeah. And Doug lost his life and Rob died. And then
So that might have been a terminal mistake on his behalf.
Clearly.
They both should have just gone straight down.
Clearly. If Rob had just said at that point, look, we got everybody up to the top or most everybody on the team except for Doug.
But the year before, Doug was turned around just prior to the summit.
Also, yep. And Rob and Doug became good friends, and Rob promised to Doug if he came back that he would for sure get him up there.
Yeah.
This guy's a postal worker in Seattle, right? Comes from not a lot of means, and he was passionate about climbing. He wanted to get up there, and Rob cared about him as a person, not just a client who was going to give him money. So that's where this nexus comes in between professional responsibility and like your, being friends and
too emotionally involved.
Yeah, I guess so, and also just it's on an emotional basis, but a good guide will want to be professional and protect the client, but also really care for these people and try to help them achieve their dream. I mean, that's
right.
That's the essence of what this relationship is about. It's about safety and teaching or observing and steering people away from those dangers, but also helping this person achieve their dream and making that all come true. So yeah, it's a tough balance.
For sure. What was it like when all of a sudden that storm hit and you couldn't see and you didn't know where anybody was and everybody's in different locations? And
yeah,
I mean, I just can't even imagine that nightmare unfolding.
That was intense. So you asked earlier, like when I realized the shit was hitting the fan. So on the way down, well, just very briefly. So I waited at the summit from I got to the south summit at like 10 p.m. I looked at my watch. It was, for some reason, I remember exactly, it was 10 p.m. And I sat there by myself. There wasn't a person on the planet Earth higher than me for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I mean, I was looking at the summit of Everest. That's the highest place on Earth. And I was at the second highest place on Earth right there. And there wasn't anybody between me and them. And you think like a third grader right there. And it's like, that's how it goes. You're like, holy cow, I'm the highest person on Earth. That's the logic. And so the best you can do is a very sort of diminished state of mind, So, but anyway, so I'm kind of like flipping around here. So you asked like what it was like at the end. So I got to the summit at 1:25, and I stayed up there until 3:30, waiting for our clients to come, who I could see for the last hour or so approaching the top. They weren't very far away, but it just takes forever. They're slow, and I'm just waiting up there, and I figured Scott allowed them to go. So I've been above essentially 29,000 feet already now for, 5.5 hours.
Are you getting cold?
Not cold, but I turned my oxygen down really low because I just knew that you just can't blow through it all.
How cold is it there?
In the sun that particular day, it was really cold ski day, 10 degrees maybe,
not
0.
Bad, but not bad.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a down suit on and all that stuff, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah. So are you starting to get lightheaded?
In and out, like you have to like, you find your mind kind of wandering. It'll kind of wander over here, wander over there, and you got to like force yourself to think really hard. It's a struggle to pay attention. It's what analogy could you make? I don't know.
Falling asleep driving down the road.
Totally, right? Yeah, something like that. Being super, super tired, being really bored with something. I mean, all these times where you need to stay 100% focused and you just can't keep your mind like locked on what you need to do. And you can't think like a bunch of steps into this. Like you can't say, well, if this happens, then that happens, and that happens. Your brain's not working at that capacity. It's like you're thinking about the next decision, perhaps maybe a decision and a half ahead. That's all you can muster up there. Right? So I finally, when all of our clients got there, it was like, okay, Scott's not here. I don't know what's going on. Rob's still doing his thing. There are people all over at the top, but here are all the clients. They're all accounted for. Anatoly is already gone. We got to get down. This is late. And I can start to see that the storm has moved up the mountain and the weather's way worse below us than it is above us. I don't know how bad, but it's like no screwing around. We gotta move. So I try to get all these people stood up, and some of them are, you stand up and then you go to the end of the line and you look back and the first people are already sitting down, and they're tired, and some of them want to take photos. They just made it to the top of Mount Everest, right? And you've been up there forever, and you tell them like you got to go, and they're like, no, I don't want to, or I can't, or whatever. So eventually we start down. It was about 3:30 or so. I can't remember the exact times right now. I'd have to go back and almost reread the book to remember some of the specific details. But we passed Doug Hansen on the way down, and I took a photo of him. It was the last photo taken of him, and he was leaning on his ice axe above the Hillary steps, struggling to the top, and that was before Rob had come down and assisted him to the top. And I figured I'd pass Scott somewhere along the way, and I did. Scott was struggling on the way up, and he was on a track slightly below me, so we said a few things, but we weren't exactly face to face. And I just assumed, Scott had climbed Everest without oxygen, and he was a tough bastard. He's one of the best American high altitude climbers at the time. Figured for whatever reason, he had his reasons, and he would tag the summit. He'd probably catch us right away, and we'd all help and get everybody down, and we'd deal with the storm and whatever. We'd get down safely to the South Col. And Scott kept going up, and as it turned out, he made it to the top, but wasn't able to get all the way down. So I'm now with I think I had 5 people with me, all but one of. I gotta think through this. No, I had every client with us at that point. No, except for Martin. Sorry, Martin wasn't there. He had gone down ostensibly with Anatoly, but Anatoly didn't wait for him. He continued down to the South Col alone. So I've got all these people with me, and we start gathering some of the clients from Rob's team as well. We get to the South Summit. People are out of oxygen. The timing is really late, so the reserve bottles that had been set there had been grabbed by people that needed oxygen. There was no coordination anymore about whose bottles were whose and whether or not it was, it was a free-for-all for the oxygen. And not all the bottles were there. I made 2 people exchange bottles for one person who wasn't doing as well as for somebody who was doing well. And then I started grabbing one person, you can read book, by the harness to get her to come down. She was just out of it. And I grabbed her harness, and she was sliding down behind me on the rope. And at the end of this steep little pitch, this little runnel that had been created, of descending down this little thing, she slammed into me. Her crampons went through my down suit. There's feathers flying everywhere. And she finally kind of came to a little bit after getting a shot of dexamethasone and getting oxygen turned all the way up, and was able to walk on her own, but slowly. And now we're starting to descend into the storm while the storm is ascending as well. And it's getting gnarly. I mean, the wind is howling. You can't see very far. It was super intense. Is that an airplane?
Yeah. So the wind was howling, 60, 70 mile an hour winds? What?
Yeah, it was starting to gust to that. So they got stronger as we went down. It's starting to get cold now, and you feel the wind chill. It's not paralyzing yet by temperature only, but the wind is, it's crazy strong. You can't look into it. It's just blowing. It's like putting your head 2 inches off the sand on a beach when the wind's blowing. You're just getting pelted by the ice crystals. And you can't speak. So some people still have their oxygen masks on. A lot of people have already run out of oxygen. So it's just like a neck gaiter. It's not doing any good for them. You're screaming and yelling. Nobody can hear you. You're trying to keep them together. Halfway down the fixed line, I came across this body just sitting there motionless, looking out. And it was one of Rob's clients there, Yusuko Namba, who had summited and had descended on her own, and she had run out of oxygen and just sat down. She was done. And I mean, she wouldn't have moved another inch had I not grabbed her arm and picked her up and, kind of got her moving, and I locked arms with her, and I wasn't dragging her per se. I mean, her feet were moving, but as soon as I released, pressure on her arm, she just would slump to the ground. And carried her as far as I could, across the South Col. The ropes were fixed on the steep part, but the South Col is this massive expanse of land. It's really big. It's, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of yards on each side. And it's flanked by these very steep walls. So you're kind of walking up and down these undulations, all these rocks and ice and snow and, sastrugi snow blown in and whatnot. There's old oxygen bottles and beaten up tents and poles, and you don't know where you are because it's just years of people camping in different places, and it's dark and the wind's just howling. You're in a ground blizzard and there's no rope. So we're kind of blind navigating back in the direction that we thought the camp was, and the wind's pushing to one side. So kind of in retrospect, of course, it's obvious, but the wind kind of kept pushing us down
off the line,
downwind. Yeah, right. Exactly, off the line. And we ended up going the right distance, but we're several hundred yards, to the left of where the camp was, and we can't find the camp. We know we're on the South Col. We're not lost per se, but we've lost the tents.
Right.
And people are stumbling now, and I just realized that if we don't stop and regroup, somebody's going to be off the back. I'm not going to be able to keep track of everybody. I'm barely keeping track of what I'm doing right now. And so I had everybody just huddle up, and we put our backs to the wind, and we just going to try to wait out the brunt of this squall or storm or whatever it was. And it was, got to be late at night, well into the morning. And during the storm, there's like thunder and lightning, and it's just instantaneous. It's just fire and brimstone. It was intense, and it starts to get very cold now. It's, John, I think, estimated 20 or 30 below. I don't know, maybe. It was freaking cold, and the wind chill was horrible. And now pretty much everybody's out of oxygen, and you're just sitting, and you're cramped up. So if you're not aware to try to, like a skier sitting on a lift, right? You keep yourself warm. You got to keep moving around, and people are just sitting there, and people are nodding off and fading. And, that's when I realized this is
bad.
Yeah. This is how people die. And I remember telling myself that, but also telling myself, it's not going to be me. We're not going to die here. I was like, not going to happen. But I realized that this is it. This is how it goes down. And I tried to stay alert and look for signs that the storm was abating, and, yell at people, slapping them on the backs, and, efforts sort of waned, and then, you get some more energy to do it again. It was hard to do. We were there for hours. And finally, the wind was still raging, but I looked up by chance, and I happened to see Lhotse, and then around to the side, Everest, the summits, in some starlight, or might have been a little moon, I don't remember. But you're in this ground blizzard, but it's like, okay, this is just wind now. The basic squall of the storm has passed. This is our chance. If we don't move now, people are not going to live through the night here. We got to stand up. We got to find these tents. So I screamed to everybody to do that, and I tried to grab Yasuko on her arm again and stand her up, but she couldn't stand anymore. She just slumped to the ground. There were a couple other people in that same position, but there were a few who could get up. And there were 4 of us out of our whole group. Might have been 10 or 11 people total. I can't remember exactly. And we thought really hard, and we tried to use everything at our resource and our experience and figure out what direction to now walk to try to find the camp. So just because you're walking doesn't mean you're going to find the camp. You're still a ground blizzard. You can't see anything in front of you. So we walked into the wind, and we gave it our best shot. And as it turned out, we walked almost directly into where the tents were. And Anatoly was there. He was, he had gotten down to the camp early by himself, and he tried to mount a couple attempts to go back out to carry oxygen back up and meet people, but the storm was so bad, even Anatoly, world-class climber, he couldn't even leave the camp. It was too intense.
He was lucky to find the tent upon returning.
Well, he gotten down quite early, just as the storm started getting bad. So I'm
talking about once he started to find the rescue, to go up and rescue people.
Yeah. Well, once you sort of have your bearings, we're talking about several hundred yards now. You can kind of figure that out back and forth. So I explained, and Clev explained, kind of different versions of the story of where we were and the description of how to get there. And Anatoly tried to get some other people to go out with him, and nobody would. Everybody was either wasted or unwilling to go. I mean, these are dire times. You're at 26,000 feet. People are, if they had climbed, they're wasted. They're barely like staying alive in their own sleeping bag and tent now. Or a couple of the Sherpa who had remained at the camp, they're terrified. This has been a storm of 70 miles an hour, right? They're holding on to the tent for dear life, like it, hoping it doesn't just blow away. rip and shred.
And you still have all your clients at this point?
No.
He had already moved back to the tent.
Yeah. So Martin Adams had gone down earlier, and through some luck, he had he had kind of gone off the wrong side and got encouraged to come back up, and he made it back down on his own. I had with me Charlotte and Tim and Lena and Clev and geez, I think that was it. You're kind of and Sandy Pittman. So I had 5 people, I guess, with me at that time. And I was the only guide with our team. And then there were 2 Sherpa with us, and then Mike Groom from Rob's team, Yasuko Namba, the woman I brought down who was from Rob's team, Beck Weathers was there. So I think that was our total crew at that point. So anyway, I get back with Anatoly and given the directions best I could. I thought Anatoly had some oxygen there, so I put that on. I thought in a few minutes I could try to recover, drink a little bit of tea, and go right back out. And I realized that was...
You were toast.
I was toast at that point. I recovered, and eventually a little bit, to help people when they came back. But had I gone right back out, I would have just caused more trouble than I was worth. I would have not made it back probably myself either.
I think from reading Left for Dead, Beck Weathers' book, and the story from Into Thin Air, isn't that the greatest comeback of all time? Right?
It's pretty crazy what happened to that guy. Yeah, it is, right? That is a story of survival and luck.
Explain what happened to him and how, coming the greatest comeback of all time, what that actually means and what he did.
Right. So Beck was, I like Beck. I didn't really know him on the trip. He was with Rob's team, but he made a couple of decisions that I think he admits are not very good. One, he had some issues with his eyes. He had some surgery, hadn't fully recovered from that. His eyes weren't able to focus very well. He got out of camp a ways and told Rob that he couldn't see and whatever. And so Rob told him to wait, apparently, just to wait. Right. And Beck, I guess, if that's what happened, took him at his word, and that's exactly what he did all day.
He could have gotten down.
Night. Totally. People passed him and even asked him or said, Beck, come with me, right? And the injury or the surgery he had with his eyes was exacerbated by the dark. And once it gets really light out, especially at those altitudes, it's so bright, your eye becomes like a little pinhole camera, and you can see well enough to move around. He had the opportunity to go, but he didn't. So for whatever, he stayed there, and he became a liability to the rest of the people. So now we're descending, and we find Beck still sitting there struggling and doing whatever. So Mike Groom, the other guide with me, now has to devote all of his attention to helping Beck get back to where we huddled up. And then in the course of that night, he just, he loses it. He's like, he can't go once we stood up and tried to get back. And when Anatoly came back out, he looked at Beck and basically said, look, this guy's too far gone.
He was all but dead.
All but dead, right? Not dead, but...
All but, yeah.
All but, yeah. You have to understand where you are. Like if you're at the front door of an emergency room, he's going to be okay, but not at 26,000 feet in the middle of the night in a storm with, a couple guys that are wasted.
It's like unconscious.
Out of it, right? Yeah, he's out of it. So anyway, he's left there, and then the same happened to the woman that I got in there, that when Anatoly got there, he's like, I can't help her anymore.
Right.
So, that's a tough decision. Anatoly's not around. Yasuko died there. Beck lived. So, Beck sort of has the story from his perspective of what happened there.
So Nikki, what happened was, he was left, and they all thought, just like, Yasuko, of whom died,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they thought he wasn't going to make it. So
he was there. He ended up getting up in the middle of the night and walking off the mountain. And a number of hours later, walked into a tent, right?
Well, it was in
like, where'd you come from?
It was the next day. It was more intense than that, actually. And he was left out there. And then in the next morning, some of the Sherpa went back out from his team to try to help them back, and realized, including one of their clients who was a surgeon, like a doctor, like full on,
right?
Professional. Big time. Yeah. And they're like, this is active triage where you just go, can't do anything for these people at this point. Right. They have a pulse, but they're gone. We cannot drag them down. Even if we get them to the tent, what are we going to do at 26,000 feet? We have no supplies. We have no resources to deal with this. So it was a tough decision for those guys to walk away from that. So, and then during the course of the day, there were other attempts at rescues to go back up to find Scott, also with Rob Hall. So remember, these other people are still way up on the mountain. So there's this whole other story still happening from way up above. We can talk about it in a minute. But back to Beck, after the people who could leave the South Col that day did, I went down eventually with our clients. I mean, I was the responsible. I was the new lead because Scott wasn't back, so I had to go down with these guys and kind of help them the best I could. Couldn't just say from 26,000 feet, like, see ya on your own, right? And we kind of descended at different paces and whatnot, but Sandy had more issues on the way down. I had to give her more medicine on the way down. But anyway, that evening or that late afternoon, the sun comes out, and Beck somehow senses the sun on his face. Some internal clock, well, barely. Something happens, right? Some switch flips, and Beck kind of breaks himself out of the ice. This isn't like you just sit down. I mean, after that much time, you're
petrified.
You're drifted in, right? You're like,
you're
part of the mountain.
You're part of the mountain, right? And I don't mean to laugh at this whole thing or Beck, but this is a really serious deal. And Beck just somehow breaks himself loose. And part of hypothermia, as you get really into the bad states of it, your body starts sensing that you're warm when you're not. So he's unzipped his jacket. He's taken his arm out of his jacket. His glove is off. And he's trying to figure out where he is. He can't see very well. Everything's all murky, according to him. And he starts walking, and he somehow stumbles into the camp in the afternoon. And some of these guys who had come up to rescue him, Pete Athens, who had come up during the course of this, it ran up there. He sees Beck, and he's like, oh my God, this guy's arm is out frozen porcelain white. He looks like a freaking statue, like something out of a B horror movie, right? Like, oh my God, what is happening? So they chuck him into the tent, and they fully believe there's no way he's living through the night anyway. And Beck's hands are frozen, so the tent door can't get shut, or wasn't shut, or somehow, I don't know the circumstances, but he can't even manipulate anything. So he's in the tent and he's thinking, I'm going to die again right here. Right. And in the morning, they help him, and they walk him down as best they can. He and this other guy, Makalu Gao, who was a Taiwanese guy on a team of one or two, I believe, who was with Scott and got rescued where Scott couldn't be rescued that same day. They walked him all the way down after a couple days, and then the highest helicopter rescue ever occurred from Camp 1. So this is at 20,000 feet with a French Squirrel helicopter, and the pilot, a Nepalese pilot, was super brave and a very good pilot. And they took everything out of the helicopter, they stripped it. They chucked all the emergency gear, everything. And he flew from base camp up there. He barely was able to land it. They put one person at a time in, he turned it around and he didn't just like lift off and fly away. He basically just using ground effect got just off the ground and kind of slid down over the edge until he got enough airspeed to then fly out of there. And he did that twice. It was intense.
How did this whole thing, how does it affect you today?
Oh, big question. I guess the first answer to that is that it's been a really long time, right? So 96, this is
24 years.
24 years. So, I've thought a lot about it. I've given presentations, I've talked about it. I'm probably the only person who hasn't written a book about it. This interview is probably the most on record, I've ever talked about that night like this per se. So every question I've heard and I've thought about it a million ways. So I'm not surprised anymore necessarily by my feelings towards it or the questions or whatnot, but it was a really big event. And, as much as I like to think that my life just continued on and that was something that happened and I'm kind of doing what I would have been doing anyway, that's not true. I mean, it's naive. And the fact that you're interviewing me wasn't because I ski raced in college, right? It was because of this trip. And a lot of good things have come about because of it for me. And I've tried to, spin that back and be positive for other people and, returned that favor in many ways. As I said, I wish that it never happened. No amount of all this kind of stuff was worth the lives of those people.
Yeah.
But it did, and you can't take that back. You can't change that.
Has Everest? We'll wrap this up.
Yeah.
This last question. How does Everest sit in your heart today?
In a pretty good place. So that's a very, very good question. So it was unfinished. The whole experience left a very big hole for me, and it was a very unfinished chapter of my life until I went back in 2011 with Chris Davenport from here in town, a very good friend, pro skier. And we guided one person who was a friend of ours. So we had a very small team. And the goal was to go back and obviously climb safely and to prove perhaps to myself that you could guide safely and competently, if the numbers were right and you made the right decisions. And we had a great trip. It was successful. Guy did great. But a big part of the trip for me was to go back to that place and to walk past Scott's memorial and Rob's memorial and Doug and Andy and, just experience the Khumbu again and go to Everest and to not leave the mountain in the same place in my heart that I left it in. I don't think that Everest is bad. I mean, Everest wasn't trying to do this to us. I mean, we did this to ourselves. And I wanted to go and close that chapter and have good feelings going forward about the mountains, about climbing, and I was able to do that. So I'm still sad about what happened, and I will never gloss over the events that happened that day. But time moves on, and we all move on. And right now, I have a fond place for Everest in my heart, for what it is, and for how powerful it is, and the experiences that it can dole out to people, both good and bad.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to relate this to fishing. Like a lot of our guests we've had on, when they see Steve Huff is like the god of guides. He's like the chosen one. When they see him fishing or in the water, it's like they see a unicorn. And when I see you in the mountains, whether it's mountain biking or climbing or something, it's like I saw him. He's a unicorn.
Oh, well, that's super nice of you to say. It's just like total. I mean, that's not. There are so many good climbers and guides out there in the world who have, spent their lives doing it. So I've done this many times, but it's not been everything I've done. And there are people who are truly unicorns out there, but I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Like at the opening, I said, you are a legend among giants. A legend among giants.
Thanks,
Neal.
thanks, Andy. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's just a real honor to be here with you guys. And as I alluded to before, you were a big part of my life growing up. Really quick, I'll relay a very, very fast story, very funny story. So, I was ski racing, but I can't remember exactly how many years older you are than me, but we'd been on the hill before and all that stuff. So when I was perhaps a sophomore, high school, maybe a junior, 76 junior, right? So you had just raced in the Olympics.
76, right.
Coming back from Innsbruck, right? And I don't know if you remember, but when you got to the Aspen airport, there was a little gathering of locals and whatnot. And
red carpet and the band.
So I love music. So I was in the frickin' band, right?
Really?
So I was there with my trumpet, right? And I was like, it's kind of weird. Like I feel more connected with you as a skier, having, been on the hill and, run gates at the same time. But there I was at the airport with, the band, and you were coming back as a hero, a local Aspen hero, a national hero. And I thought that was just the most awesome thing in the world.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's hilarious.
What an honor.
Yeah.
What an
Holy
honor.
cow, right?
Then and now.
Yeah. So that was
Thank you.
how long ago is that? That's a long time ago.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Neal.
All right. Yeah.
Very much appreciated.
Appreciate it very much.